look up learning how to learn on the internet, you get like a lot of really cool techniques to hack your brain. You get things like growth mindset versus fixed mindset. Thank you, Heather. And you also get things like the difference between diffuse attention and focused attention, the difference between long-term memory, short-term memory, how to keep things like mnemonics, how to keep things in your brain. But I think that the precursor to all of these learning how to learn techniques is the idea that you have to change your relationship with your brain. So I started learning how to code about a year and a half ago. And when I had first started learning how to code, I came from a purely non-technical background. I was working in the restaurant industry for about 5 years before this. And that entire time, nothing that I did had immediately transferable technical skills over to coding. So when I decided, oh, I want to learn how to code, this is kind of what my brain, up here on this slide, told me. My brain had this little human up here is the electrical impulse that represents the electrical impulse that travels through my brain as I think. And the moment it thought of engineering, it thought immediately of math. And historically, my experience with math is not the best. And so the moment I associated anything with math, my brain kind of went into a haze and it started thinking, oh, incompetent. Because you never, in your past, have ever been good at math, so why do you think you can do this now? Which immediately leads to, I can't do this. I'm gonna have to find out where it is that I'm pointing to. Cool. And when I realize that I can't do something, I like to default to 3 different modes to alleviate my stress, which is either 1, screw this, I'm gonna move to the woods and live off the land. It's a very real fear, guys, I'm not kidding right now. Or I'm gonna meet up with friends, or I'm going to go on a Netflix binge show. So for the sake of this example, let's assume that I decide to screw this, I'm gonna move to the woods and live off the land, which inevitably leads me to YouTube rabbit hole on survivalist strategies, which ultimately ends in me crying myself to sleep. And if you're curious about what happens with the other 2 options, they're not that much better. I complain about my life. I wish my life was like a movie, and ultimately I end up crying myself to sleep. So when I first decided that I'm gonna learn how to code, I kind of put a pin in it, and I decided, you know what? I can't do it, obviously, because this is kind of what I ended up doing. But then I had another hard day at the restaurant I was working at, and I was out there, I was sitting in the parking lot. I wasn't even in my car, I was like on the sidewalk. Like the sidewalk was covered in trash and like people spit from like smoking cigarettes. I was just sitting there very dejected and I was thinking like very nostalgically, hey, remember that time like a few weeks ago when you thought that you could be an engineer and you were gonna learn how to code? I thought about it and I realized like, oh yeah, you know, that was such a failure, like you really suck. And then if I thought back to my actions then, I realized that I didn't even try learning how to code. What I did was I bought a multifunctional hatchet off of Amazon, and then I hung out with my friends for 3 weeks. I did nothing, I took no actionable steps to actually learning how to become an engineer. And this in and of itself was kind of a really like big wake-up moment for myself. I realized that I let my brain tell me what it is that I can and cannot do. And I didn't realize that my brain was a tool in which I could use to learn things. But up until this point, I have always thought like, what my brain told me, like it had the culmination of all of my experiences I've ever experienced in life. And up until this point, everything that I have learned up to this point was I use my brain to learn all these things. And so if my brain's gonna tell me I can't do something, it's probably right? Wrong. Your brain is a tool. It's not something that can tell you what it is that you can and cannot do. What you do with your brain is you learn how to learn, which is why there are so many cool techniques about like hacking your brain, thinking about like the ways that you can like hack your long-term and short-term memory using mnemonics to remember things. Like Heather said earlier in her presentation, it was about learn, research, experiment, and iterate. That is how you grow connections in your brain. So I tried to begin, I was like, all right, look, what I'm doing right now isn't really working, so I'm gonna try and equate engineering with something that I'm very familiar with. And up until this point in my life, in college, I majored in philosophy, and my emphasis was in logic. And so I was thinking engineering has a lot of problems with words. Essay questions, computers. It doesn't really pew all the way through because I wasn't actually tackling my fear of being afraid of math and thinking that anything to do with math, which is what society had told me up to this point, is that if it has to do with math and you are a woman, you cannot do it. It is the worst thought process to think of. And eventually when I realized that, I ended up discarding like the general thought process that I had, the habits that I was so used to thinking, and I confronted my fear of math. So math, I realized had a lot to do with questions of input and output. And the thing with majoring in philosophy was that my emphasis was logic. And logic, if you guys haven't taken a logic course before, it has a lot to do, it looks just like math. You do proofs with like Greek symbols and like variables, and you do proofs much in the way that mathematicians do proof. But in my head, I was able to do logic because I equated logic with philosophy and not logic with math. And therefore, I never had that fear of learning how to do logic. But once I realized that my fear of math was completely irrational because, like I said, like your brain is a tool, like what you practice thinking is what becomes true. I ended up learning more about computer programming, and I ended up being able to eventually make the very slow and tenuous connections into logic and computer programming. But eventually, I ended up as a paid engineer in the field in San Francisco. And now I work, thank you. And now I am a backend engineer here in Postmates. So my point is this, like you can look up how to learn and you can look up what it means to hack your brain and figure out the best way to do things. But before you do that, you have to change your relationship with your brain. If you don't recognize the habits that your brain takes and you think that, like you let your brain tell you, oh, anything to do with math you cannot do, like it is a habituated thought. Your brain is very much like a muscle. If you keep thinking these things, you're gonna be very good at talking yourself out of doing anything that has anything related to math. However, if you could take a step back outside of your brain and maybe draw a mind map, much the way that I did while writing this talk, you realize that the things that you think that you are doing, like the things that you think that you are capable of doing, if you keep thinking those things and you give power to that thought and you let it dictate your actions, it'll become true. But if you are able to take a step back and realize that isn't the definition of who you are, and you can do whatever you want because you do with your brain what you wish to do, then you can, like me, go from a completely non-technical career into being an engineer in the field. Thank you. Up next is Bianca.